So, iconic feminist, author and public intellectual Bell Hooks is being remembered for her enormous contribution to public discourse. She died this week at the age of 69. She's authored around 40 books in a career spanning more than 4 decades. Hooks is also being celebrated for trailblazing works on the impact of sexism and racism, particularly on black women. Her work has also been cherished by scholars and activists who live in Africa and the diaspora. So, to discuss her contribution to the feminist movement globally, here at home as well as other issues, let's bring in senior researcher at the Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, who joins us now via our telephone line. And Ms. Pheko, it's always great having you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for always making time. You know, in the many reflections that have been given over the past couple of days after hearing of Bell Hooks' passing, I can't help but note how ironically Bell Hooks has also given us the language of grief rooted in love. And many people are actually using that to reflect on her contribution. How are you remembering her as a public intellectual?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and thanks for the invitation. I'm still slightly reeling from her passing because I think on a personal and on an intellectual level, her fingerprints are very much all over me, especially as a younger black woman growing up. In my teens, I leaned very much on the scaffolding of works by her, Angela Davis, Maya Angelou, and then later on, of course, discovered so many voices on the continent and in this country, people like Amina Mama and Patricia McFadden, of course, our very own Loretta Ngobo, Miriam Tladi, and so forth. But I think it is important that she gave us a lot of the language, as you rightly say, the vocabulary and this notion. I've spoken in a lot of my work around the notion of radical love. And I think even in public intellectualism, the notion of love that speaks out. And when we speak about things that maybe are uncomfortable or seem unpalatable, or even, talking about the ways that the state behaves towards the people and so forth, it is coming from a place of deep and radical and fundamental love. And much of that is to do with her own languaging of love. Love is courage. But the other thing, of course, is that the language that she has given us from intersectionality, so really the intersecting forms of oppression. And she was very passionate about how these intersection forms of oppression manifest in the States. They manifest in the loss of literacy. And she says a lot around how the loss of literacy is one of the ways of actually ensuring that many black people in particular, but the population and black women were excluded from the broader society, excluded from broader discourses. And she was very, she wrote children's books that many people may not be aware of. She was very passionate about black boys, as well, in addition to being a revolutionary Marxist feminist. As the other thing that languaging she gave us was the languaging of class analysis. And she says quite a lot around how class is not just about how much you earn and where you live. She says that class is about what you expect from life. Yeah. The expectations that you have, the way that you expect life to rise up and meet you. And that is so much deeper than the car that you drive and where you live. And, really complex ways of looking, not just about feminism, about being about women's issues, but as what she called a broad-based political movement that seeks freedom for all.
Absolutely. What was always fascinating is watching the likes of Bell Hooks. You've mentioned Angela Davis. People mentioned Kimberly Crankshaw. There's talk of Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou. What they've all managed to do really is help us distill really complex lived experiences in beautiful words that are empowering. So with that in mind, how would you place Bell Hooks in the canon of black intellectuals at our disposal? Where would you put her, especially for people who haven't come across her work for whatever reason?
Somewhere close to the top of the pile. Probably two steps from heaven, I think. I think she was just a phenomenal Ayanda. I can't speak highly enough. I mean, she speaks about things like education as a practice of freedom. She speaks around things around the practice of ongoing learning. As you rightly say, she speaks about this notion of love. She speaks about the need to understand difference. She also speaks about being pluralistic, so that in effect, she says that just naming things is not enough. Just depicting violence. I mean, she had sharp critiques about so many people and personalities and dogmas. But she says just naming things is just not enough. It is violence to name a thing and not take action against it. So, I mean, she and people like, I mean, she's a contemporary of people like Henry Louis Gates, otherwise known as Skip, people like Cornel West, slightly older than people like Robin D.G. Kelly, who might be known to some people, in the diaspora. But I think that the other, in relation to our own, amazing scholars, as a woman who was a public intellectual as well, just the fact that she was able to speak so radically. I mean, I hold her in the greatest esteem. And I think the other thing that I think is important, one of the lessons that she teaches me personally, is the notion of self-reflection. So self-reflection as an individual, self-reflection in terms of scholar and scholar activism, but also self-reflection, what self-reflection looks like at state level. And I mean, I think you and I have spoken many times about states, about governments, about, different circumstances, and policy deficiencies and so forth. But she speaks very clearly around self-reflection. And also remember that she was really cross-cutting so many issues. She spoke about gangster rap. She wrote a phenomenal essay on Ice Cube, on gangster mentality, and she really interrogated it. She interrogated the popular culture, popular works of people like Spike Lee. She interrogated the notion that every black woman is an ally, and she mentions people like Condoleezza Rice, and she says that some not just because we're all black women doesn't mean we're all allies, and she describes some people as fascist women, and in fact as tools of patriarchy, of fascism, and of capitalism. So I think that just the breadth of her insight, the breadth of her intellectualism, and I think the confidence with which she stands in her own shoes is something that, again, I take great inspiration of, because of this kind of propensity to be quite self-effacing and, it's only little me. And she teaches me personally, and I think many people, black people and black women, that their voices matter and are important on many issues. And I think for me personally, one of the greatest contributions she has made is what she calls white capitalist supremacist patriarchy, because almost all of the work that I do is kind of launching in from the construct of the political economy, international economics and international relations, with a strong tinge of radical decolonial feminism and African feminism. And the languaging is what, for me, places her as a pantheon. And just to say in conclusion that, of course, bear in mind that the fact that she's given us so much amazing vocabulary as a post-colonial and multicultural feminist shouldn't be surprising, because, of course, her first 2 degrees were in literature.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just so much to speak about. And as you were speaking, I'm reminded by some of the reflections that I also came across in the wake of her passing. Someone actually pointing out that, what was really quite phenomenal was to watch Bell Hooks, even in her critique, to root those remarks in love. And I can't help but juxtapose that with, some of the criticism that is being leveled against public intellectuals who seemingly give critique that doesn't appear to exhibit that. And perhaps it was just a unique gift that Bell Hooks has, but certainly a strong mark of her legacy.
Too much, absolutely right. I mean, the fact that she would take on people, I won't mention names, but, she would take on some of the different intellectuals and her peers and her younger peers, particularly in the U.S., and then a few weeks later, she's sharing a panel with the same people, and I just thought, but that's the kind of maturity that is required. And also, I think that in the realm of public intellectualism, as part of the, even part of the fifth pillar of nation building and of state building, that we don't need to always view these things as personal issues. Right. It's not personal. It is academic. It is important. It is discoursing. It is trying to arrive at ideas and at a pathway that makes sense to as many of us as possible. And sometimes our paths are different. Our interpretations of those paths are different because we are shaped by our own personal standpoint, which is inherently chauvinistic, which is why we should consistently be self-reflecting, but also reaching outwards towards other people, other communities, other ideas, because then we do run the risk otherwise of becoming self-referring and completely myopic in our own personal views. And that's like something that I think she, whilst being stubbornly critical, but lovingly so, she managed to avoid many of those foibles. Perhaps not all of them, but many of those foibles.
Yeah. Of course, because her critique was so wide-ranging, doesn't necessarily mean that she herself was absolved from being critiqued by other public intellectuals. In fact, in her own reflections, Sonke Msimang actually pushes back against Bell Hooks' interpretation of Beyonce's Lemonade. And part of what she points out is it appears that Bell Hooks and scholars of her time had centralized a lot of their, call it activism, around pushing back against things like capitalism, and in that moment aren't able to see ways through which other feminists are pushing back against other social ills. I mean, that kind of reality, the fact that she was so great, doesn't necessarily mean that people didn't disagree with her a lot of the time, and people who hold her in very high regard.
Absolutely, and we should. And I don't think that she would have had it any other way, because indeed, I mean, I think if we're not willing to engage and to disagree and to agree respectfully, to reflect, then I think that that she herself would have been running the risk of becoming the kind of personality cult and the kind of self-referring cult that I think many of us would not want to become and would not want to be associated with. And I think looking back at many pieces of work, I mean, it's important that we can love people and still take issue with some of their work, especially because the context is moving all the time. And I know the Beyonce and Bell Hooks debate and the debate of whether or not Beyonce is indeed a feminist and what. I don't want the beehive to come after me, so I'll say less about that. But I do think that that these are what I also find quite exciting about that is that, look, she was on top of her pop culture, and she was on top of things that, people of my daughter's generation, and in fact, my older daughter was introduced to Bell Hooks because of that whole Beyonce debate. And I'm like, well, in a roundabout way, that can only be a good thing.
Right, right. It's difficult to not speak to you and also, I guess, realize what's happening even around your own career. You've recently been appointed to the National Planning Committee. Congratulations are in order for that. So I guess, as we reflect on contributions made by public intellectuals like Bell Hooks, what kind of role do you reckon their work can play in the contemporary work that people like you continue to do? The National Planning Committee just being one of those platforms.
Oh, wow, what a segue. So I guess the curveball. I guess, infinite. I think the work of public intellectualism is exactly as I've said, to be as critical, attempt to be as independent as possible. But I do think that what's also very useful in this is the radical repositioning of what the centrality of humanity means. And one of the things that she certainly spoke about was how feminist theory and black love is really about the recentering of humanity and accepting that humanity comes in multidimensional forms. Now, how this translates into policy, public policy, development policy is always the challenge. And I think just to analogize that, what some of the work and the things that you said around, for example, the notion of welfareism, and I say that in inverted commas, social grants, and how these are not, in response to the whole argument that these create dependency, and that they create, intergenerational dependency, blah, 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 all the poverty shaming, sometimes quite racist ideas that people have, and especially in the U.S., and some of which are unfortunately the conservatism that is also seeping into some of our own society across class lines, is to remember that fundamentally the presence of social grants, for example, is because of the absence of a viable economy to some extent. The absence of viability of sustainable work, of sustainable options. And, to remove one without doing something about the other seems to be the ultimate form of violence. And that's one of the things that I was quite drawn to when she was speaking. And I think that the work, I suppose, that many of us are going to carry into the commission will be to try to bring together the absence of one and make sure that there's a presence of the other.
You and I can speak till the cows come home, but TV doesn't allow for that. Let me thank you for your time. Really do appreciate your insights. Ms. Lebohang Pheko is a senior researcher with the Trade Collective, and one can only hope that this discussion becomes a springboard for many other interesting discussions around the contribution and work that Bell Hooks has been able to leave us with. She's passed on at the age of 69. All right, July.